Um, Dumi, let me bring you in here by your insights on what's happening in Botswana. I remember you wrote a lovely piece I enjoyed on Openly News about Botswana's decriminalization of same-sex relations safeguards my dignity. Can you tell us a bit about, what since that moment, what things have looked like, and what the landscape is currently in Botswana around LGBTI rights, and the kind of work that you are involved into?
Okay, thanks so much. Welcome. I think just to answer the first question is really about the fact, and let me present a very, I think, a good analogy of the landscape within our region. You have two court cases, high court cases, on the decriminalization of same-sex conduct in Botswana and in Kenya, which I think, Zuki and Robert also coming from former Commonwealth, or rather Commonwealth countries, right, former British colonies. And I think with these two court cases, what I then sort of noticed is that you found that there were two different outcomes. So of course, the High Court decriminalized same-sex intercourse in Botswana, but then in Kenya you had the opposite, right, where it affirmed these colonial laws. However, society's reaction was the same. So you had obviously religious influences that were opposing, and they were a lot more vocal compared to the milestone 2013-2014 registration case. And I think for me that says a lot. It's really quite telling, and this is where I think it comes into the work that Success Capital does. And that really looks into safeguarding and strengthening voice and visibility in public spaces, but not just that, in that you need to transform the individual and acknowledge the individual, because after all, when we're talking about safeguarding rights, we're talking about individual rights. And I think, when you look at the timeline in terms of how far we've come as a country, with the very first case, and that had to do with sodomy. It was back in the late 90s. I mean, from the time that it was registered with the magistrate, it took at least 7 to 9 years for it to get to the Court of Appeal. Fast forward into, 2013, 2014, and it took literally 2 years to get to the Court of Appeal for the registration of an LGBT organization, which I think then also marks some form of progress in terms of justice. There were, a lot of milestone court cases that were, for instance, speaking to gender progression in terms of inheritance when someone's parents were to pass, because previously, obviously, that meant that only men were to inherit laws. So I think when we're looking at the landscape within the context of strategic litigation, there has been progression, but then society has always been lagging behind. This is despite a lot of research speaking to, society somehow changing their perceptions and becoming a little bit more tolerant, particularly with the Afrobarometer documenting some of these experiences. And for us, we then sat and we're like, when we look at a lot of these large-scale strategic policy level forms of, research and knowledge, how then do we then sort of translate it into our lived experiences? And then you learn that a lot of young queer individuals don't necessarily relate directly. For instance, I like giving the analogy of where someone speaks to, I can't eat GDP. Or for instance, there's such a huge gap in terms of, let's say, sexual behavior that I don't really feel the implications because maybe the laws were not enacted. So I think the fact that, there has been a general gap between law and society has allowed for tolerance to occur. But I think the fact that we were recognized, we were acknowledged on the 11th of June in 2019 meant that a lot of people were now quite surprised with our existence. They was quite surprised with the fact that now there is a legal a space for us to not just exist, but also to claim our space, and I think what's beautiful about that is that it's allowed a lot of other individuals to sort of expand on their work. And I think for me, what is then really telling is that we then realize that politics really plays itself across board.
Mm-hmm.
Politics plays itself in terms of media, what we the judiciary. So we found, it took, I think, about a month later, and it was during elections when opposing political party basically, started speaking to or equating the High Court case with the president. And I think, for me, you then realize that there was an assumption that the populist narrative would work in our country, that aligning with more anti-rights framing would be able to garner votes. And I think that's something that didn't work. And so for me, it's then telling in that when you get the political will, when the political leader can actually affirm and support a political group, that is the first step towards unlocking liberation. And I must just say, I think, Robert touched on, the HIV response, because obviously that's where a lot of funding went, that's where a lot of advocacy related within the, human rights framework of public health. And it's important, it's critical, because it's literally life and death, right? But I think as movements evolve, as issues evolve, and as individuals come out, as young people come into the space, they then want to explore. They want to be a bit more creative. They want to understand, what does it mean in the context of poverty? What does it mean in the context of sustainable development? And that's where for us, for instance, yes, climate movements have been emerging over the last 2 to 3 years. But, what is interesting is the fact that in 2015 or 2016, we were already doing a lot of thematic art around climate issues. Sorry. So I think for me, it's really about, acknowledging the individuals and the fact that individuals are multifaceted, the fact that individuals are not so linear. And I think, what Zuki was speaking to when we're speaking about, decolonization, when we're speaking about acknowledging the realities, you cannot separate the queer from, for instance, being bigger bodied. You cannot separate being bigger bodied from, for instance, being non-binary. So I think for me, that's where the power, the power really lies in that you're recognizing individuals who can hold space, not just within, the comfort of their community and the comfort of their homes, in some instances where it is safe, but also in public spaces, whether it's religious, whether it's community or in the kotla, which is our customary courts. So for us, it's really about harnessing the interests, the dreams, the aspirations of these resilient, diverse, beautiful individuals, and not necessarily the needs. And I think for me, when I look at needs framing,
No, go on.
So when we're looking at the needs, framing, that's when you're talking about something that might be a lot more extractive. You're talking about individuals who, for know their rights. Look, if someone difference between rights, that people harm, affirming harm and preventing it. So I think, for me, we've always been investing in the individual and trying to ensure that the individual, in whatever space, in whatever card they've been dealt with, that they're able to deal with it. And that is far much more sustainable than having someone come and save the community.
I love how you are exposing kind of the complexity of LGBTI rights as far as they're concerned, beyond the immediate needs, as important as they are. And I'm trying to understand how the LGBTI fight works, with the kind of dilemma you're proposing around the idea that we are pretty much fighting for, or what we are talking about here is expression, that we are talking about, that people should be free to be who they want to be and free to express themselves freely. But yet you have so much backlash in society that's preventing people or disallowing people from kind of expressing themselves freely, and I want to hear from you here, even when the laws say you can, be yourself, you are recognized, that kind of limitation on the stigma that's already attached is something we also need to consider in our kind of struggle against these anti-LGBTI laws. And I'm curious, I can start with you, but I'd like to hear from everyone around how this fight of, pretty much getting people from hiding in the shadows to being themselves out in public and fighting public perceptions, as well as trying to change the laws. So are you finding that since the legal framework has changed, that there is a kind of empathy from society, and how do you think that plays itself out as far as people being able to express themselves freely beyond the kind of negative social implications that come with, coming out, for example.
Yeah. So let me put it this way, so yes, there was a high court decision that basically affirmed the existence of queer individuals, but that, high court decision was still largely binary, number one, still largely obviously focused on men. So it's not necessarily any easier for trans individuals, for instance, to change their gender markers. There's a significant number of steps that one needs to take, which means it's attached to resources. Similarly, when you sit and look at, public health, you then realize that gender affirming healthcare is left wanting, from mental health deficiencies in the wider public health system, even to ensuring that you're able to get gender affirming, whether it's, hormonal therapy or even gender affirming surgery. Those are things that are not necessarily readily available. They're not part of universal healthcare. And I think, a lot of people have obviously been very visible. A lot of people have been very vibrant and thriving within their own spaces, even when they're out, even when they're well known. And I think, that what the change in law really just did. And I think, we must also separate the fact that decriminalization doesn't necessarily mean that there are protections that are inbuilt. And I think, the fact that it took a significant amount of time in terms of generous interpretation that is expanding the grounds of the prohibited grounds of discrimination meant that, a lot of people within their own lives, within their own experiences, had to come out if they wanted to come out. They had to explore their sexuality. They had to understand what it means. And I think this was also maybe enabled with the fact that there's a significant number of LGBTIQ organizations that exist today. But I'd like to then, sort of even just give an example of, your equality courts in South Africa, the fact that they're underutilized, the fact that they exist and the infrastructure is there, but then the uptake is left wanting. And this is where I think for me, when I sit and I think about the law, when I sit and I think about policies, they're there, yes, to provide protection, let's say if you're looking for an order against someone who's threatened you, or they're there when you feel like you want to get a remedy from someone doing harm. But the harm is done. They're individuals who are sexually assaulted in their homes. They're individuals who experience hate speech. They're individuals, and that's where, for me, I think that when I speak about the gap between law and society, liberation, yes, you can sit and talk about it within the context of law, but if I can't, for instance, fill my empty stomach, that doesn't mean I'm liberated, right? And I think this is what is very critical. And the fact that the state has sort of expressed intention to appeal is still just saying there's still a lot of uncertainty around how do you then build equality, how do you then ensure that there's certain safeguards that can prevent harm. And I mean, when we look at the scourge of gender-based violence, you then understand that a lot of the harm that's perpetuated and a lot of the injustices that are perpetuated aren't necessarily easily avoidable because a law will be enacted. Botswana still has the death penalty, which is obviously a huge concern for human rights activists, and people still believe that having a death penalty means that there's a curb in violence. That is not a reality because people are still being murdered. So I think for us to then really understand what liberation means, it's then centering off of the basis of Ubuntu, of Boto in Setswana. I am because you are. So my existence as a trans or as a queer individual means that you can acknowledge that when I'm not well, you're not well, right? And that's what that's what this current crisis should be teaching us. But that's not what we're seeing. Individuals who are already isolated aren't necessarily still a part of the community. You don't see anyone sitting and expressing solidarity. For me, solidarity and support comes with economic implications. It doesn't help for you to publish a statement because that doesn't change my reality. My home is not safe, and you're still telling me that I must stay at home. So I think the need for us to recognize, and when we say we're holding space in public society where there's voice and visibility, that means people are being considered. That means we're able to exercise our autonomy and we're able to get buy-in and we're acknowledged. We are the 5% that's missing from the UNAIDS 95-95-95 strategy. When those individuals who are identified as the last mile forward in terms of sexual reproductive health and rights, for trans individuals, for instance. So I think it's very, very important when we sit and talk, liberation. Yes, the legal frameworks are there and the policy frameworks are there, and a lot of people are doing a lot of great work around that. But we must also acknowledge that, at a very micro level, we must acknowledge that there are a lot of people who are left out. And it doesn't have to be unique to sexual orientation. It doesn't have to be unique to gender expression, because they're anchored on patriarchy. Zuki mentioned they're anchored on colonialism. They're anchored, as Robert mentioned, off of the fact that we're living in a framework that is obviously very strong in terms of public health and strategic litigation. So we're forgetting some of these other multifaceted issues that are affecting our communities, because after all, we're part of society. So it doesn't help if I can get an HIV test, but I don't have a job. It doesn't help if I can get ARVs, but I don't have adequate living provisions that will show that my medicine is okay for me to take. So these are some of the things, I think, when we say social determinants to health, that are often neglected, that are often not necessarily fitting within M&E indicator frameworks, that we really should bring into the forefront. And that's when you include the community. That's when community holds space. That's when you have representation. That's when we occupy public spaces equitably and not just equally.
I
Can I jump